Hi, hello everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Truthful Ministry podcast. We have today our first repeat guest of the podcast.
Woo.
Cody Lewis is here for his first appearance on season 2 of the podcast, and a couple of things to get out the way. I hope you're a fan of birds, because there is a bird's nest, I think, like right next to where we're filming, and I'm not going to go kick them out, so I hope you're cool with hearing that in the background a little bit. I know when we filmed with Anna, there was a plane that went over at one point, so We're just making it work. We're just making it work with what we've got today, but super excited to have Cody. Man, I haven't seen Cody and had like the opportunity to like hang out and chat for like months, but normally that's something that we've been in a pattern of doing. We've gotten to hang out a couple times through like other events, and like we've kept in touch, but in person we usually have like check-ins where Cody's almost like an accountability partner of sorts, where we just talk about what's been going on good in our lives, what's been going on bad, how we've been in the Word, and just different things like that. And it's just Cody and I relate to each other on a lot of different things, like being involved in nerd stuff, like we talked about last time on the podcast. Right. But also we've both been in ministry, and we've both just had like similar lives of like coming to Christ a little bit later in our lives. Like we weren't like necessarily born into like the most Jesus like oriented family and things like that. So We've got a lot to relate to, and we're both just nerds about not only nerd stuff like games and movies and things like that, but also like the Bible and Jesus stuff. Like you can be a Jesus nerd in a way.
Yeah.
So Cody and I have a lot in common, and today I was like, man, I know he's going to be another good person to have on the podcast. And I'll say too, this could either be our longest or our shortest episode. I'm not sure. And normally I like to prep everybody on like what I'm going to ask, but this week I just kind of forgot. It's been a busy week. And so Cody and I went over what we're going to talk about just a minute ago, and we have like not as many topics to cover this week as I would normally have, but they're all going to be a bit more in-depth and like deeper, heavier topics in a way. So there's a lot to say there, even though we have less like bullets to check this week. So we're going to hop in. One of the reasons you've been so busy is because you've got a newborn.
Right.
You've got a child in the house now. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So one thing we've talked about a lot, just me and you, but also on the podcast last time, is the importance of like quiet time and just studying your Bible, having time with God, worshiping, whatever it looks like. And so tell me what's like the household adjustment been having a newborn in the house now, and how have you been able to manage to still be able to say, hey, even though I've got a child and a life I've got to take care of, and maybe that child is crying and being loud, whatever it might be, finding time to be intentional and say, hey, I'm going to try and stay in a pattern of making sure I have my time with the Lord. Just what does that look like for you over the past few months?
Well, before I say anything, just for the record, I got back from summer camp with the youth last Saturday, and my voice still hasn't 100% recovered. So I can talk now, but if I have to cough, that's why.
Okay.
I'm not sick right now. I don't got the Rona. But yeah, I think it's been both a benefit to my devotional time and a new challenge to kind of figure out. In many ways, if anybody listening to this has kids, they know what it's like. When you have kids for the first time, in just about every way, the rhythm of your life has changed. And in that regard, that shakes things up, and it introduces new challenges and new ways that you've got to think about, how do I order my life. And so for those first couple months after my son Solomon was born, it was a lot of just Courtney and I trying to figure out, how do we do all the stuff that we've been doing. Because, we have, between us, we would meet once a week and do family discipleship, which of course is going to be important to maintain as we have kids.
Right.
And what we would normally do is we would do that kind of after dinner at the end of the night. Well, now we have a baby, and that's about the time he's starting to decide he wants to go to bed. And so now we're still kind of figuring out and feeling out how do we work that in and still have that weekly, because we can't just do it at the same time that we used to. It's a similar thing with the quiet times in the morning. In many ways, the way that I had been doing it before he was born, I had to kind of step back from for a little while, because between working through seminary, kind of the second half of spring and youth ministry is just a busy time in general, and then having a newborn, I had to kind of step back a little bit, and it got impacted. And kind of towards the end of the spring, I started feeling convicted about really trying to reprioritize it, and be very thoughtful about how am I going to do this and how do I need to adjust the way I'm doing my quiet time to be able to do it daily. And so what I've gotten more into the rhythm too is just rather than sitting down and having this really deep dive study, which I like to do, I get a lot of that with seminary as it is. And so, as life changes and things develop, that affects the way that you should do your quiet time and approach it. And so since I'm getting that deep dive study time at school, if I do that in my quiet time, it feels like I'm doing schoolwork rather than spending time with God. And that's the important part there, is that I'm just spending some time listening to God however he leads me in his word, rather than trying to squeeze every ounce of, bit that I can get out of the text during that time. And also that makes it a little bit more flexible. I don't need, perfect uninterrupted silence for an hour or so, which is important when you have a baby. And so that's kind of adjusted as well to now I just kind of pick up the book. I'm reading through it chronologically right now.
Dope.
And just read about as long as the Lord leads me. I will usually set about a chapter or so for myself to read minimum, but sometimes God takes me longer than that, and just kind of pray over it and try to isolate at least one particular truth that God is speaking into my life through what I just read. Sometimes it looks like doing quiet time while you're holding a baby.
Yeah.
And so then he's just, he has to cooperate.
I think that's really good. Just talking about, you said the words of, like, it should change. Like, how your quiet time looks like should end up changing, like, as your life changes.
Yeah.
I think, like, I know for me, I'm a person who, once I've gotten into the routine, I like it to stay that way.
Yeah.
And if something comes up, or if I have a reason to change that routine for some reason, or if something has, like, thrown a wrench into the plans, I feel like it's very easy to just abandon it altogether, rather than take the time to say, hey, this can't look the same anymore, but how am I going to keep it? How am I going to figure this out? That's for anything. That's like for your gym routine. Like, if I normally go every day at a certain time, and then all of a sudden, hey, I'm going to be gone at that hour. Like, I'm going to have a shift change, and I've got to start working then, or whatever it might be. It's easy to say, oh, I just can't go to the gym anymore. And, like, figuring out how to get that routine to shift is difficult. And I think you said, like, the word flexible is important. And it's relying more on just the spirit and, like, the motivation behind why you're doing it, rather than just doing it to be doing it. And rather than saying, hey, like, I'm supposed to do this, it's like, well, why am I doing it in the first place? Because if you're just going through the motions, it can be, I think it's a lot easier to just say, oh, I don't need this anymore. Like, oh, there's something that's come up, I'm not going to do it anymore. Right. But when you're saying, man, like, I'm doing this because, like, I want to get closer to the Father, it's a lot harder to, or I guess it's to say, it's a lot easier to say, man, this is my time to get closer to the Father. Like, I need to keep this up. Like, this is something I like to do. I want to do it, that kind of thing. So, yeah. So I'm curious.
Also with that, too, I know being unwilling to be flexible with it and being unwilling to be humble about it, and acknowledging that the way that you study your Bible, the way that you do your devotion time, you're not reading any explicit instructions in the Bible that says this is the way that your devotion should look every time you do it. Mm-hmm. And so for all of us, our devotion time is ultimately governed by a few basic principles that need to be present. That's meditating on his word, and praying and retreating to a degree from the world in that moment. And just kind of considering throughout church history how Christians have been able to do that. Before the printing press, the vast majority of Christians throughout the history of the church didn't have access to their own personal Bible. Mm-hmm. And so they're not doing the majority of the history of the church. The average Christian doesn't spend time every day poring over the text. But what they're doing is they're meditating on the word as they have stored it up in their heart, and spending time in prayer. And prayer was a greater focus, a greater emphasis. And so just kind of thinking about that, like I remember as a young adult, I got into a really in-depth pattern with my devotional time where I was really deep diving into the Word and spending 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour every day studying the text. And that was good, and I'm thankful for that time. But as life changes, that became less doable and less enjoyable, as I started doing, schooling and things like that. Like I said earlier, it started to feel comparable to what I was doing as work. And so what can end up happening if we don't have the humility of acknowledging, hey, that devotional method was one that I chose for that time. If we lack that humility to acknowledge that, then we can kind of get in our head as that's the correct way to do it. Yeah. And if I don't do it that way, then I'm not doing a devotional properly. And so it's not worth doing if I can't do it the way that I have done it. And that's not true. There's like I said, there's those few core truths that need to be present, and spend a little bit of time meditating on the Word and spend time in prayer talking to your Father. And that can take many different shapes. All of which, as long as that's present, are good and pleasing to God.
Yeah, I think for me, I'll say even I think it looks a lot different than it did. I would say 4 years ago. For a while there, about 4 years ago, is probably what I would say was my peak devotional time. I would go to work every morning, and I worked a really weird shift. I worked 7 to 12, and for my other job, I'm in bivocational ministry, so I wasn't just doing ministry, but from 7 to 12, I'd be at work, and then I'd come home, and I would get home, and I would read my Word in this recliner in our living room, and man, I'd almost be falling asleep reading the Word because I woke up early, and I'm not an early riser by any means, but I also just worked a 5-hour shift, and I was working with kids and stuff, so I was tired. But I'd sit there, and as long as I could, basically, until I finally got to the point where I was like, all right, I just don't think I can even focus anymore. And then I'd take a nap. And it was so good, it was so consistent for me of just being able to read, and it was a good way to wind down from my day. And it was perfect. Some people are first thing in the morning I got to do it. For me, I was nah, first thing in the morning, I'm going to wake up, I'm going to shower, and I'm going to head to work. I can't focus as well in the morning, so I do it right after I got home. When I changed that job, and just over life has changed up and down, I've had different moments, but I think right now I'm getting back into it where in the mornings I'll go for a run, and what I find is I'll get up, get motivated, I'll run, and when I get back, I'll sit on my front porch, and I'll turn on some worship music, and I'll just sit there. And sometimes I might not even read the Word, and I'll just sit there and jam to worship music, and just kind of think about life and pray and think about God, and it's been so good finding a new way. But again, it's talking about it looks so different than it did before. Getting home, sitting in a recliner, and reading the Word, and now for me it's more of just a genuine time of worship almost, and a time of focusing on God for my day, rather than for me I'm a very logical person, and so I feel I like to, you were saying, the correct way. For a long time I was the correct way for me to do this is I really need to be reading the Word and studying it and having looking up answers and pastoral what's it called, commentaries of the Word. And for a while I thought that was kind of the correct way, and I think that's why I kind of fell off and on for so long. And just recently I've been getting into the idea of, well, man, maybe it's supposed to look different for me too. I've been finding this way of just a new light, worshiping, just chilling, relaxing, focusing on God for me. And it's been less super heavy word study, write a paper in your head focused, and more of just focusing on God. So that's really good. I hope people hear that and that inspires somebody to mix it up. I was very curious, I was going to say real quick, how have your students reacted to you having a child now? What's that been like?
They're into it. They were annoyed with me because I wouldn't let them hold them right away. Yeah. We got a bunch of girls in our group that are just love babies. Yeah. And, the doctor told us not to really bring him to church for about the first 2 months, just to make sure his immune system was developed and stuff like that. And then even after that, make sure people are washing their hands before they hold them and stuff like that. And so, they were very happy once they were allowed to hold them. But yeah, they're into it.
That's cool.
I do fun voices for them and stuff, which they get a kick out of. So,
another thing I wanted to talk about is, speaking of your students. So last year, we kind of did a collaboration thing, and I was invited out, and I got to do a fall retreat with your students. So for a weekend, we were in some cabins and on this Snipes campground. It was really cool. We kind of split who was going to do the sermon, and so I think I gave 2, you gave 2, and man, one of your sermons was just so well timed, and in my mind I was just like, the world needs to hear this. Like, so many Christians, like, you were giving it to middle schoolers and high schoolers, right? But I feel like, man, college students especially need to hear that. Like, younger adults need to hear this. Older folks needed to hear this. And it was just the message was so good that it applies to everybody, because Scripture applies to everybody. But you specifically were talking about Abraham and how Abraham was sort of called to go a certain direction. And you talked about like how weird that might have looked at that time, and the conversations he probably had to have with his family around that time, and just all of the things that he was sacrificing. Like, I remember one thing you mentioned was just the idea of like safety in general, but also like career safety. Like, where he was going, there probably wasn't like a good career outline for him out there. He wasn't going to make it big or anything like that. But just talk to me a little bit about how much you remember of what that sermon was on, and the concept of like sacrificing things when you're really following Jesus, how some things like just have to be sacrificed. Like, there's going to be some conflicts, and just talking about that, and maybe even your own personal relation and how you were able to relate in that sermon. So just give a summary of it, or however you want to go about it. Just what are your thoughts on that sermon? Because it was so good. We could talk about that the rest of the podcast if we wanted to.
Yeah. It was about a year ago, so I'll see what I can remember.
Okay.
In many ways, when I think of the story of Abraham, kind of the major theme, I think, and the major kind of point of Abraham's story is communicating the necessity of faith and the primacy of faith in our lives as followers of God, and kind of an early on simple definition and picture of what does following God with faith look like. And in many ways, the faith of Abraham is one of willing sacrifice, of open hands, of, God, I don't know what you're calling me into, and I don't know what it's going to cost me, but I'm willing to follow you into it. And so we see that pattern over and over again in Abraham's story, where he succeeds and he does trust God, and we also see examples of him failing to trust God and the consequences of that. When he's initially called out, he's living his life as the son of an idol maker in Ur, which is far to the east, in kind of the eastern, what we would call the Middle East today. And he's just living his life, and he's older. Like, he's not like a young man being called out. So he's set in his ways, and God appears and speaks to him and calls him out and says, follow me, go to this place that I will tell you. You don't even know where he's going.
Right.
So there's no way he can make any kind of financial plans for like security. He's married. He has responsibilities of taking care of his wife. He has, servants. And so he has people that he's responsible for, that he can't make plans as, am I going to be able to take care of them? Am I going to be able to take care of myself? The financial safety net at the time wasn't from the government, it was from your family. And he's being called to leave his family behind and go.
Yeah.
And so in many, many, many ways, what God was calling Abraham to do was to abandon everything that makes him feel safe and secure in the world and follow him. And that's no different than what he's calling us to do. He's calling us to be willing with open hands to say, God, whatever you ask of me is yours. If you're asking me to risk losing my job, my life is yours. If you're asking me to risk, I think at the time one of the contexts I used talking to youth was, getting kicked off the team. My life is yours.
Yeah.
And also trusting that what you have in store for me, God, is better than what I'm trying to keep for myself. And so
that's hard.
That willingness to sacrifice is at the core of what it means to be a follower of Christ. I mean, Jesus himself said, to follow me means, deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me. Taking up your cross is not this just pithy statement that Jesus says. He's not saying put your cross necklace on.
Yeah.
It's, but this is before the crucifixion happens in the story. And so the picture of the cross is just be willing to and be prepared to expect to have to suffer and be humiliated and to suffer shame, to suffer everything that people of the world live their entire lives trying to avoid. That's what it means to follow me. Deny yourself. Deny everything that you want for yourself. Deny your own desires. Deny your own plans. Take up my suffering and my shame, and then you can follow me. And then when you follow me, then you can enter into the blessings of being called a son of the Father, of being co-heirs with Christ, of being, of receiving the surpassing peace and joy of walking with Jesus. You cannot obtain that without giving up who you were.
Yeah. And before we get into more of like your just story and walk with that and that idea of sacrifice, like I think one of the reasons that I find that just so relevant, and I was just like, man, like I hope everybody hears this sermon, I hope everybody understands this, is just because I think we live in a world where it's so tempting to say like, hey, yes, I follow God, and yes, I want to be a Christian and all these things, but here are all these things that I also want to have. And that's good to have your own passions and desires and creative thoughts, whatever, but like your own goals. But at the end of the day, like living for Christ is definitely means living a certain way. And like you said, there's going to have to be those things that like don't make the cut. Like if you don't make the team or whatever it might be, those were good examples. Just because so many people say, hey, like I know I want to go to church, or I know I want to do this, or I know I want to follow the Lord, but this thing came up. Like right. I've just heard, I think we've both had stories where it's just insane to us where someone will say like, oh, well, we can't go to church because we have like a family thing coming up. And in my mind, I'm like, what? Like, what do you mean you have a family thing on a Sunday or on a Wednesday night? Like,
why are you planning family stuff on Sunday?
Or like, I don't know, like, yeah, we really want to do this. We really want to go to church and stuff, but we've just been like really busy. Like we have this work thing and then I have to rest, or I have this practice comes up on that time. And it's just, man, like these are all, like there's nothing inherently evil about playing sports. There's nothing inherently evil about hanging out with your family, but man, if it's getting in the way of your relationship with Christ, at what point does it become less of a, oh, this is just like a no big deal, a small roadblock, and more of a, this is preventing me from going where God wants me to go? And I think that a lot of people just haven't, it's hard, like we talk about again, like the Truthful ministry is just sometimes like things that we hear that are the truth are hard. And because I think the more people that are willing to say that and like encourage you like, hey, this is how it's going to be, the easier it will be for people to make those sacrifices and understand like, yes, maybe I have been putting this thing above God, or maybe I have been avoiding bearing my cross or carrying my cross because I've just been so focused on this other thing. But when everybody's doing it, or when it's kind of the norm, like you get into a church culture where the norm is to just kind of miss things, or to not make these sacrifices, or to maybe go along with the world in a certain way. It's just the norm, it becomes the pattern. When nobody's speaking the truth, it's a lot harder to be the person to stand out and to say, hey, I think maybe this is wrong, or I think maybe I should prioritize the Lord. To talk about in your life, because you did mention a little bit about like how maybe some of that's come up for you. Like you talked about Abraham leaving his family behind and these sorts of things. Talk about in your life what that's been like to say, hey, I'm a follower. Here's what I believe. Here's what I believe God wants and God says. And so here's where I'm at. And that's how my life's going to be, and what kind of repercussions have come from that just in your life.
Yeah. I mean, there have been many. I think you mentioned towards the beginning, you know, I didn't grow up in a Christian family. Mm-hmm. You know, I grew up with a single mom, and in many ways growing up at different times, there were, you know, different guys she was dating. Don't want to make it sound like, you know, there's just a new guy every week or something. It wasn't like that, but, you know, I remember I got saved when I was in 7th grade. So I was, I think, 12 years old. And that introduced challenges because, you know, I'm following God in a family full of people that aren't. And they weren't antagonistic per se to me being a Christian. So in that sense, I didn't have many of the challenges that there are people in the world that face, where they are ostracized immediately for that profession of faith. But there is an unavoidable abrasion that occurs when you're in community and relationship with people who don't follow Jesus. If you're a follower of Christ, Jesus himself said, if I can remember exactly where it was, I'd read it right out of here, but he says, I've not come to bring peace but a sword. You know, I'll set, you know, mother against daughter, father against son, sister against brother. And I think in part that's my experience growing up. That was what I felt a little bit, is as I started growing more serious about my faith, that was the main point of tension between me and my family. I remember in high school for several years, my mom was dating a guy who was an atheist, and he lived with us. And he kept atheistic books in the house. I remember walking to my bedroom every day. The book right by the entrance into the hallway was God is Dead. And there were, conversations that happened, and as I strive to remain faithful to God in that, God used that, and He used that season of life where, as a teenager, you're naturally kind of rebellious, and God used my natural rebellion to rebel against that atheism, and say, you know what, God isn't dead, and I'm gonna prove it, right? And I got a lot more serious about looking into apologetics, and that's where I developed at very early on, by God's providence, a real care and a seriousness for not running away from questions and doubts, but embracing them, and exploring them, and trusting God in the midst of those, wherever He takes me as those questions are prompted. And He's always led me to answers. Sooner or later, He's led me to answers.
I'll say real quick, I don't know the verse. I know there's one in here, but I don't know the one that says about the sword. I don't know if this is the same verse, but I always think of Luke 12:51, where He says, "Do you think I came to bring peace on earth? No, I tell you, but division."
That's what it is.
Okay.
It's a different translation.
Gotcha.
In the ESV,
I figured it was
sword.
probably a different translation. Yeah. And then there's a couple times when He's talking about what the end will look like, and He says there will be two women at a grain, and one of them will go, and He's talking about brother against sister and things like that. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
What's the verse address in there?
This is Luke 12:51.
Luke 12. I knew it was Luke. Yeah. But I don't know. It's one of those where it's I'm pretty confident it's Luke, and right in the middle of Luke.
Right.
But if I say that and I'm wrong,
I remember reading this for the first time, and that's the only reason I remember this verse off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure it's Luke 12:51. It's just because I remember for the first time reading that. It does
hard.
seem like you read these pictures and people get this idea of who Jesus is, of just he's just this lovey dude, and he just loved everybody. And it's he was one of the nicest people ever, but he still meant what he said, and he was still clearly about a certain way of life, and he was still saying hey, I just gave a sermon a couple weeks ago at a church, and I talked about building your life for the Lord, and I talked about how sometimes being a good builder means knowing what to tear down. If you're a good enough builder, you can say, hey, man, this foundation isn't going to work, or oh, that beam is going to go, we're going to have to get a new one, whatever it might be. Sometimes being a good builder means what you have to tear down, knowing what you have to tear down. And so I brought up how in John chapter 8, He saves the woman from being stoned, but at the end He's hey, has anybody condemned you? And she says, no, no one's condemned me. And He says, well, neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin. It's hey, I love you enough to say, man, if nobody else has you, Jesus has you. I've got you, man. I love you. I don't want you to be stoned by these people. But I'm also letting you know, I love you enough to tell you that some of the things you're doing have to go. This has to be changed. And that's just an idea of, being somebody who's so loving that you understand, hey, I love you enough to tell you that this isn't going to work. I love you enough to tell you that this doesn't align with God's will. You have to make this change. And that's what I see in Jesus from this verse, because it is kind of, glaring. It is whoa, Jesus is saying, He's going to divide people. What He's saying is, man, there's going to be the dark and there's going to be the light. Because in order for me to be the light of the world, there's going to be people who stand against that. There's going to be division here.
Yeah, I think a big part of Jesus' message that's overlooked in the Sermon on the Mount, which is arguably the most significant block of teaching that Jesus gives that we have access to. I'll just read it here, Matthew 5, starting in verse 17. It says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished." He's referring to the fact that, the entirety of the Old Testament is not being replaced by Him and what He's doing, but is being fulfilled in Him, and that still has implications for us under the New Covenant. Continuing on, verse 19, "Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." And this is the kicker. This is a verse that is overlooked a lot, and this would have been one of the most radical things He says in the Sermon on the Mount. "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount doesn't relax the commands of the Old Testament, doesn't relax the demands of a follower of God. He ups the ante, right? He's like, the Pharisees at that point were considered the most righteous people, right? Like, we read them like through the lens of the Gospels. It's like they're the bad guys. They were the good guys of the story. Like, they were the ones striving to honor God in a world full of people that weren't. They were the ones that were trying to keep Israel being serious about obeying God. And Jesus comes in. Their sin in the gospel is not that they were doing things wrong before per se, but that they were rejecting Jesus and his correction of what they were doing. And so when Jesus says your righteousness has to exceed that of the Pharisees to enter the kingdom of heaven, like, that would have been something that they would have heard and said, there's nothing we can do.
Right.
There's nothing we can do. And, you know, praise be to God that he acknowledges our weakness and he is righteous for us. But then the rest of the Sermon on the Mount is instruction of, listen, you have to live more righteously than the Pharisees are living, because what the Pharisees are prioritizing is external righteousness, right?
Yeah.
That's where he continues on. He goes, you've heard that it was said, you know, you shall not murder, but I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. You know, saying it's not just what you outwardly do, but the desires of your heart, the inward part is important as well. I think that's mainly what he's talking about. He's like, yeah, you need to live, if you're going to be a follower of Jesus, you have to live and strive to live righteously. Externally, through your actions, through your words, the way you interact with the world, but also, and this is where he ups the ante, you need to strive to take your thoughts captive, to transform your heart. And that's something that you can't do by yourself. You need the Spirit. Romans 12, 2, you know, do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind.
Come on.
You have to sit in the presence of the Spirit and be sanctified, not just in your external actions, but to raise the standard of righteousness to be someone who is holistically following Jesus and his commands. It's not just, you know, I got dunked when I was 7 at VBS and now I've got fire insurance and that's what it means to be a Christian. That's not at all what it means. And what he describes by the end of, and throughout the Sermon on the Mount, and by the end of it, is this picture of, if you will follow me in this, then you can have security and peace, right? But if you won't follow me in this, right, then you're going to be, and this is what's at the end, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell and the floods came, the winds blew and beat on the house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. That's the fate of those, not just non-believers. This isn't Jesus saying, if you become a Christian, then, you know, life's going to go well for you.
Yeah.
That you're gonna have, you know, as much peace and joy as you could have. There is inherent blessing beyond just being saved and following Jesus and in giving your life to him. But Matthew's gospel, and the way that it presents Jesus' teachings, makes it pretty clear that what Jesus is calling us into is like, hey, if you want to enter into and experience even more of the blessing of being, you know, a follower of me, then you have to actually follow me.
Yeah.
Right. Take my yoke upon you, is probably the main thrust of Matthew's unique testimony of the gospel. Take my yoke upon you, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Come to me, and I'll give you rest. You don't get to just...
Yeah.
You know, that's more than just the moment of salvation, I think is what he's talking about.
Yeah, dude. Come on. Hey, there was a TikTok clip in there somewhere. You were spitting. That was good. Oh, man. And just that idea of following, that was also good. Before we go on to the next thing, just speak briefly on, we were talking about like what that's looked like in your life. No, you're good. That was a good tangent to go off on. But just tell me about in your life what that's looked like to say, hey, I'm following the Lord, and so to a degree, like there's going to be conflict there, and you, because you've taken that step, that so many people, I think today, so many people, we talk about like the term lukewarm. There are a lot of people, especially kind of where we live, to be honest, that are just sort of going to church, doing the external part, and just kind of calling it a day, and thinking they have, like you said, getting dunked and then getting fire insurance. But taking that next step, that was a good quote, taking that next step of just like truly trying to live for the Lord and taking your thoughts captive, and also saying, hey, some of this is going to look like cutting out certain people. Like what fellowship does darkness have with the light? Like what business do I have with these people if they're going to be tearing me down or pulling me away from the Lord, or something you watch, some sort of media, whatever it might be. And so in your life, what has come from that decision to say, hey, I'm following the Lord, regardless of whatever else happens? I feel like it's hard for me to like allude to what I already know, but you just go ahead.
Yeah, I think one way I'll nuance something you said, and then I'll share some stories. You said like sometimes we have to cut people out. I think the way I would change that is I don't think that's necessarily what the scriptures are calling us to. I think rather there will be situations as you're following God and relationships that you have where you have a moment of decision of, am I going to stand for God and speak against what this person I love is doing, and risk them abandoning me and forsaking me for the truth that I'm standing on? Or am I going to compromise on the truth in order to maintain this relationship I have? Even if it means, that person might end up going to hell and I didn't do as much as I could to proclaim the gospel in their life, right? Because, 1 John, I think, is what you're referencing. He talks, the darkness flees from the light. Jesus is in John 3 as well. The light enters into the darkness, and children of the darkness flee from it. They don't want to be in the light. The light doesn't flee from the darkness. And so I think part of what we're called to is, enter into relationships in the world, enter into relationships with non-believers, and be light. And that often means, and occasionally at least means, you're going to have to say some stuff that they might hate you for.
Right.
And so, I've had moments like that in my life with my family. One of the bigger ones that I'm still praying through and seeking reconciliation in, and praying that God will move. Just a few years ago, it's been like more than just a few years at this point.
We're old, man.
Yeah, time keeps ticking. But I have two older sisters, and they're twins, one of which several years ago, this is after I was out of high school, so she's a few years older than me, came out as gay, and then maybe a few years after that, announced that her and her partner were wanting to get married. And so that was a moment for me of like praying and wrestling with like, what's my response to this supposed to be? And my conviction after lots of study and prayer, especially looking at the description and definition of love in 1 Corinthians 13, where he says, let's see if I can let's say it just for real. He says in 1 Corinthians 13, love does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with truth. And so if you're loving someone, you can't celebrate their sin with them. You can't rejoice with them in their sin.
Yeah.
And if you are doing that, then you're not loving them. You're prioritizing their opinion of you over what they need, which is truth and goodness. And so my conviction was, I don't think there's any way you can attend what is a wedding without celebrating what's happening. I think there's an implicit approval that you're giving when you attend a marriage.
Yeah.
Whatever marriage it is. That goes for, that's not just homosexual unions, but also a more standard marriage ceremony. If you don't think those two people should be together, you have a responsibility to say, hey, look, that guy or girl, I think it would be foolish if you married them. I think it would be detrimental to your relationship with God. I think it's going to pull you away from Him. I think it's going to be harmful to your life. I don't think you should marry that person. You can't then just be like, well, I said my piece. I'm going to go party with you.
Right.
Right? So anyway, that conversation ended up having to happen with my sister. And in many ways, that relationship was cut off there, right then and there. And there was it was well over a year before I even saw her again, because whenever we had family functions, there was always a convenient reason why she couldn't be there, things like that. And I received a lot of pushback from my family. Even my other older sister, who's a Christian, who came to a different place of conviction on this than I did. It's another conversation. Like they try to, be like, you should really reconsider your stance on this. I was like, I can't. And that was one of those moments of like, God, if this is what you're calling me to, if this is the sacrifice you're calling me to, make something of it. Like I trust you to use it. And I was talking to my wife about this just a month or so ago, about how God has unexpectedly borne fruit in that.
Yeah. I was just about to say that. I was about to be like, dude, tell me about that. Because,
I mean, like I said, my family didn't grow up Christian. My expectation with that was not just my sister would cut me off. I thought my mom would be very angry with me. I did get cut off for a little while from my grandma. There's some awkward stories I could tell in there. But for the sake of time, I'll leave them out. But my mom didn't cut me off. And over the past year or so, I've seen her and the man that she's married, like getting more serious about their faith. Her now husband got baptized earlier in the spring. They've been going to church regularly for a year. She's studying the Bible and wanting to know how to study the Bible. Like just a few months ago, because of a conversation we had at Christmas, where she's like, I want to know how to study this. I don't really know what I'm doing. And I offered, like, well, be happy to like do like a lesson with you guys sometime. That, came to fruition just a few months ago, and did a lesson on how to study the Bible with my mom and stepdad. And, which is cool.
That's awesome.
And, not to say that there hasn't been any hiccups along the way for them, as they're kind of wrestling through and struggling with it, but just unexpected blessing comes when you follow God. Things that you can't plan for. Things that, just like Abraham, he didn't know where he was going.
Yeah.
God said, follow me to this place I'm going to show you. And it's like, I don't know, like I know it's going to cost me a lot to get there, but God, I'm going to trust that where you're taking me is going to be good. That what you're doing with this, with my life, is going to bring blessing, not just to me, but to those around me, to my community. And so I've seen that in my mom's life, which has been a prayer for years. And I think a big part of that in God's providence was her seeing my conviction in my faith, and the conversations that prompted with her, because she was curious. She wanted to know why, because she didn't understand, and I was able to explain to her, like, I believe that if you're not following Christ, the scriptures are clear, you're going to go to hell.
Yeah.
And I don't want to appease my sister to hell. I believe that what she's doing is she's making vows to live in sin. That's essentially what the vows you're taking are at a homosexual wedding ceremony. Is I'm vowing to remain in this relationship that God has said is sinful.
Yeah.
And that's going to harden your heart against God even more. And so I was telling her, I was like, I can't just say, like, all right, fine.
Right.
I love her too much to do that. Even if she doesn't see what I'm doing as love, it was necessary. And I'm praying that she starts to see that in the future, and maybe, who knows how long it is in the future. I'm hopeful, though, that one day she'll be able to look back and say, the one person that was willing to tell me this mistake I made that I now see as a mistake was my brother. And hopefully God will work on her on that day, and we can have some gospel conversations then when she's ready.
Dude,
that's my prayer.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah,
that's cool to think about. And talking about eternity and talking about like what's going to come after this life, because it's so easy to focus on what's going on right now and what's in front of you and not think about how, man, like the scripture says, I think it's in James somewhere that says like, what is your life? You're like, it's a vapor. Like all this is going to go by so fast. Like how many people do you know who are, you know, like we just said a second ago, you're like, man, that's been years. Like time flies.
Yeah.
How often do we see people that say like, oh man, like time flies, man, or they're 60, 70, 80 years old or whatever, and they're like, man, it feels like just last week and all this stuff. Like time goes by quick.
Yeah.
And just talking about eternity, you and I have had a conversation before, kind of switching gears here, about like how I used to kind of be afraid of the concept of eternity. It just freaked me out because I am a person who, I get like bored easy. I feel like I always just kind of need something new to do. That's one reason why I love ministry, because I don't show up and sit behind a desk and just kind of do the same thing every day. Some days I'm a painter. Some days I'm in ministry and I'm painting. Some days a kid needs me to go to their sporting event and I'm their number one cheerleader. Some days I show up and the internet at the church is down and I find myself crawling in the attic trying to fix wires. Like it's always a new thing regardless of what it is. It's just always new and always different. I like to go on adventures. I get bored easy. And so I thought about eternity and I'm like, man, I love God as much as the next person, but like I feel like eternity up there worshiping the Lord, like, man, it's going to be awesome. But I feel like at what point after 50,000 years am I going to be like, all right, man, worshiping God's been great, but it's been 50,000 years. Like, can we do something else? Or is it going to be 1,000,000 years, 2,000,000 years? Like, at what point in eternity am I going to look around and be like, man, I feel like I've done it all. I feel like we're all done. Like, when is something new going to happen? And that concept used to just kind of freak me out, of just the overall concept of eternity and what that would look like. Because I feel like we can't handle the sense of eternity. Everything here is fleeting. I'm used to things going by. Like, I'm used to things being around for a season. So the concept of eternity just seems so big and incomparable to my brain. And I remember talking about that with you one time, and you just said some really cool things, and we had like a good conversation about it. So if we were to have that conversation again, and I was about to be like, dude, Cody, this is something that I just kind of like low-key worry about. Like, I'm obviously a believer. I feel like I'm all good, but eternity kind of freaks me out. Like, what would you say to that?
Well, for one, I think the culture wants you to think about it that way. I think in many ways, if you asked someone who was not a believer or perhaps new to the faith or hadn't spent much time studying, eternity and heaven and the new creation, what does heaven look like? I think the answer is, well, we're all going to be, we'll have angels' wings and we're sitting on clouds playing our harps, and we're just going to be, that's what we'll do for eternity, and that's what it is. And it's like, so I don't want to do that. I want to go, I want to go to hell and rock out and do whatever I want to do. And it's like, you're getting your picture of both of these places not from the Bible.
Yeah.
Because the picture that the scriptures paint is one of future hope, of an unending hope that is always in front of us. Revelation 22, then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. Also on either side of the river, the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be anything accursed, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads, and night will be no more. They will need no light of lamp or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever. And so that's a beautiful hope that we can look forward to. But I think some of the fear that you're kind of talking about is, are we just going to be sitting around singing worship songs for eternity? And I think C.S. Lewis is really helpful with this kind of stuff. C.S. Lewis, I love, not just because we have the same last name and I'm a narcissist, but because I think he's... in his own words, he's like, I'm not a theologian, but I think what C.S. Lewis is best for is using his sanctified imagination to help us develop an imaginative picture of life with God and of eternity, of that kind of the magical exciting adventure that following God is. That's one of the things I get most from C.S. Lewis that I love. You see that in his fiction. In the last book of the Chronicles of Narnia, there's this wonderful line as, you know, Aslan comes and he makes all things new and he brings all the people to his country. And they all show up and it's this like, they're on the outside of this island and it's like this mountain that just keeps going and keeps rising, and they're running and they keep going further and further in, and there's more and more as they go. And there's this line that said, quick, further up, further in. And that's what eternity is. It's a unending journey towards a glorious destination that, praise God, we will never reach, because God is eternal. God is infinite. It'll be an eternity of learning and growing more and more in the knowledge of who God is. All the things that you know God for, that you're thankful for, that you find joy and peace in this life, in the span of eternity, what you can know in this life will be like nothing compared to what we'll have in a million years walking with God in the new creation.
Yeah.
All the things that you enjoy doing, you will grow in your ability to enjoy them better for eternity. You'll just get better at enjoying the things that you enjoy doing. And so, like, you know, for example, we both play D&D. I run D&D, have been for years. I enjoy doing that more now than I did when I first started.
Yeah.
Because I'm better at it now.
Yeah.
I've gotten more skilled at it. And eternity is an eternity of getting better at doing the things you love doing, and finding new ways. You'll never be like, all right, I am now the best carpenter I can be. There's nothing more to learn. Right. We know that even in this life, like, you can always grow, and eternity is an eternity of getting to grow, eternity of getting to experience anew and afresh each day the splendors of the Lord. He's a bottomless well that the deeper you go, the more you realize that, you know, I've been swimming down, or I've been going further in for 1,000,000 years, and I could go for another 1,000,000 and still not be anywhere near the end, because there is no end. That's eternity. It's unending, exponentially growing joy and peace.
Yeah, dude, that hits. I think about something that I told you helped me to just to better envision it, if anybody's not picking it up yet. As I just thought about, like, how often today we see, like, new, like, movies or games, whatever it might be, directors, and, like, when they do an interview after, like, their big movie comes out or their big game comes out, they'll always say, like, oh, well, I was really inspired by blank. Like, for you might be like, oh, I'm really inspired by C.S. Lewis.
Right.
Well, if we were to go back in time and be like, C.S. Lewis, man, like, where'd you get your inspiration? You might be like, oh, I was inspired by this person. And there's just this chain of, like, once you see new things, like, you always have, like, a new idea, and you're like, oh, I could do something like that, like this. Like, how many people watched Jurassic Park for the first time and were like, man, like, this is awesome. I'm either going to go be a paleontologist now, or I want to make movies just like this, and just what it did for, like, the movie business, and how like, why it's like a legendary movie for a reason, is because so many people were inspired by it. And you think about, like for me, I also run Dungeons and Dragons, and so, like, playing with you, it's like, oh man, I see Cody do something cool, and I'm like, oh, this is so cool, like, I could do something similar, and that gives me an idea of, like, this. And just the idea alone of how much we can bounce off of each other and learn things from each other, or be inspired by something. Like, I picture just, like, I think in a very cinematography type way, like, I love stories and movies, and so I think just that alone in heaven, like, there's always going to be new creativity, new things to do, because once this person does something, and then that person does something, and then that's going to inspire this person, that's going to inspire all these people.
Right.
And it just feels like you were saying, like, even on this earth we see how there's always a way to improve. Well, even on this earth we always see, like, new ideas. Like, yes, especially nowadays, there's like, oh, well, people are just all about nostalgia and everybody's like recycling things. But there's always that, like, beauty of new stuff. Like, people are always coming out with new movies. There's not going to be a point on earth where they're like, well, we've officially told every story possible. There are no new characters, there are no new movies, there are no new plots. Like, we're done. It's just, there's always going to be something else. And that really helped me just as a very creative person, always looking for something new. And your conversation as well just helped me with the idea of, like, there's always going to be more stuff. And I think, like you said too, a lot of people do have a very, I don't even know the right term, just stale vision of heaven, like you said, of just sitting around praising God because it's like that's good. Like God is awesome and deserves our eternal praise. But I think it's important to note that it won't literally look like just sitting in front of God blank-faced for a million years worshiping Him. Yeah. There is that idea of creativity, and so we'll end with this before I ask you the truthful ministry question. The last thing I had on our docket today was just that idea of like creating on earth, or like being created, and like you were talking about like Adam and Eve in the garden and how what we were created for, and how each of us in our own way kind of will have a unique idea or a unique way to contribute to how we worship or whatever that might look like. That was as best as I could explain it, and then you kind of took it a lot more in depth, and you have a really good way of explaining what we mean when we say like creation, or like how I guess I would say it is like creation being created to, in a way, to create more is kind of how I would phrase it, and you explain that a lot better than I do, so take it away.
Well, we'll see, but you know, I mean, we were at the very end of the book, and I'll just go back to the beginning. When
Makes sense.
When God created all things, right? The dominant theme in Genesis 1 obviously is creation. And that's when He creates, you know, Adam and Eve, and He places them in the garden. But before we even get to the garden, and we even get to the name of the man and the woman, in Genesis 1, we get this thing that theologians refer to as the cultural mandate, which is this basically a purpose statement for what is a human being. And that's Genesis 1, starting verse 26. He says, then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in His image. In the image of God He created him. Male and female He created them. Now that concept of image is, the way that word is often translated throughout the rest of the Bible, is idol, right? We have idols of gods, right? And they're these like statues often that are supposed to be not just like if you were an idol worshiper, like a pagan, you weren't looking at the idol and being like, this is just a cool picture of what I think my God looks like. Yeah. There was a sense in which when you approached the idol, you were literally approaching and seeing and making offerings to your God. And that's, you know, one of the reasons why God in the Ten Commandments says, you know, don't make any graven images, right? Is because there is no image that we can create to represent God. Yeah. Because God already made an image. He made an image of Himself. That is humanity, right? And then in Jesus, the perfect human, is the perfect image of the perfect God. To get into Hebrews a little bit. But anyway, so as the image of God, right? God is creating humanity, and He says, we're going to make them in our image. What is the primary understanding that God gives us of what it means to be made in His image? Continuing on in verse 28, it says, and God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. And you know, he goes on and he's like, I've given you all this stuff for food. But there's a few words in there that are key. Be fruitful and multiply. So, you know, live a life that bears fruit, right? You're not supposed to be stagnant. You're supposed to be growing. Yeah. You're supposed to be producing something with your life. The primary thing that you're supposed to produce in multiplication is life, new life, right? So, the main expression of that, obviously, is having kids. Supposed to make new babies. But, you know, this isn't, he doesn't explicitly say have kids for a reason, because, you know, I don't know about you, but I didn't have a kid till I was 26 years old. Was I just not able to fulfill my purpose as a human being until then? No. There's some people that never have kids. There's some people who never get married. Yeah. Right? Paul, the apostle, never gets married. Can he honor God in this? Yeah. Right? We're supposed to be breathing new life into the world. As being human, that's part of what we're supposed to do, is to cultivate life around us. And then he also says, you know, I've given you, or fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over it. right? We have royal authority. As God is king of the universe, we are like, sub kings and queens, right? If he's the emperor, we're like under him. But we have royal authority over creation. And what are we supposed to do with it? Well, what did the king do? He created and he produced life, and he ordered it in such a way that produced joy and peace and excitement for those who lived in it, right? And he gives us the example of the Garden of Eden, right? I've created this, I've placed you in it. The rest of the world is untamed. Outside of the Garden of Eden, it's not tamed, it's not ordered. God gives Adam and Eve the garden as a template, then follow this example, go do it, right? And that's what we're called to, not just as Christians, but as human beings. What we believe happened in the fall is our ability to do this properly in a way that honors God and produces goodness has been twisted and broken, right? So rather than ordering life and cultivating life and bringing the potential out of the world that God has created by our ordering in such a way that produces joy and peace and goodness, now because of sin, we do it in a way that sows suffering and chaos and harm in the world. But that original ability to do that is innate as image bearers. We are creators following the Creator God. Yeah. That's one of the primary descriptions of God in the Bible is the Creator God. And if we're made in His image, we're made to create. The choice we have is, are we going to create in a way that honors God and reflects His glory, and therefore produces goodness? Or are we going to twist it and take these things that God has created and order them in a way that's twisted, that's broken? And that's what evil is. And, that's not just me saying that. If you read up on, like Augustine of Hippo, probably one of the most influential theologians in the history of church outside of the New Testament authors. He talked about and trying to find out like what is evil, where did evil come from, right? Is a question that was important to him. He came up with this concept known as privation, and the way that he would talk about evil is not a thing, right? Goodness is a thing. Evil is not a thing. It's the absence or the twisting of that which is good. It's the privation of that which is good. So the way to think about it is, if you picture the ideal sock.
Okay.
How many holes are in your sock?
One.
There's one hole, right?
Yep.
What happens as, like if you buy a sock from the store and there's more than one hole in it?
You're upset because
right?
There's more than one hole.
There's something wrong with it.
Yeah, there's something wrong.
Right? Something in the manufacturing process messed it up. You can still recognize that it's a sock. And in part, you can still use the sock for its intended purpose. And there's clearly an intended purpose to the sock, but it has a hole in it. And so, you have a few choices. You can try to mend the hole and restore the sock to its intended purpose. Or you can say, the hole is too big. There's too many holes. It's worn out. I need to start fresh. And in many ways, that's kind of what we're called to do. You think of anything that you enjoy or anything that you love. There is an ideal way of doing that honors God. That is a way that can worship Him. And there's a way to do it where you can twist it and break it and introduce holes into it. So, like a good example, the way it was explained to me was football. Right? You think of what are the ideals and the virtues that we are so, as a culture, fascinated in with football? Teamwork, discipline, this just kind of physical exertion, this drive to push yourself beyond. Like there's things that you can see in football that are honorable and good. Healthy competition, things like that. Like they're all good. Those are good things. Where football goes wrong is when you start to twist it, right? Where rather than healthy competition, you want to dominate and you want to beat the other team so bad you embarrass them and make yourself look good.
Yeah.
Right? That's twisting it. that's introducing evil into a thing that is supposed to be good. Or maybe it's I so prioritize football in my life that I start sacrificing other things for it, and it becomes an idol.
Yeah.
Right. I stopped going to church because I got football practice. The Super Bowl's on Sunday. Can't go to church on Super Bowl Sunday. Got to get ready for the Super Bowl. So there's that. Again, going back to D&D, I remember when I first started getting into D&D and figuring out, man, this is gonna be a real time commitment to run the game. For those of you aspiring DMs out there, it's a time commitment to run a game of D&D. I remember pausing and praying, like, God, there's a way to do this. If I'm going to use this time, I need to redeem this time for you. How can I do that? And praying through what are the things about D&D that are virtuous, that are good. The creative expression of it. You can express yourself creatively through storytelling in ways that are very honoring to God, and in ways that are very much not.
Yeah.
I've heard many stories of people playing D&D games with just say questionable story points. Another thing that's valuable and virtuous about it is the fellowship with the people you're playing with. You build relationships. I've had gospel conversations with atheists because they came to my house to play D&D. I can twist that by saying I'm going to prioritize them liking me, and so that they'll keep coming back to play D&D over risking them getting upset because I shared the gospel with them.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of thing. Like, we're called to create, we're called to produce things and to be fruitful in a way that is striving to honor God as we reflect His glory in the world.
Yeah, dude.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that made a lot of sense to me. Someone might have to rewind and watch that back, but that's what I meant when I was just like, dude, I know Cody nails this, and I remembered it in my brain, and I know the idea, but it's just not my wheelhouse to put that into words right. So, running out of time.
Right.
What is...
I talk too much.
I asked you before this real quick, what is one lie from the enemy that you want to speak against on the Truthful Ministry podcast? You're the first person to answer this twice now, being our first repeat guest to come on twice now. But what is one lie from the enemy that you want to speak against? Every time on the Truthful Ministry podcast, we ask this because there's one truth, and we're a truthful ministry, and so sometimes that truth can be hard to hear, which we've talked about that a little bit today. But there's also one truth that a lot of people say, like, oh, well, this is my truth or whatever, but here on the Truthful Ministry podcast, we're saying there's one truth. Jesus says in John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Whatever's opposed to that is not the truth. Even if it sounds good or sounds kind of right or makes you feel good or it's really close to the truth, close isn't the truth. It's still false. Even if it's 99% true, then it's not fully true. So just what's one lie that you feel like, whether in your life or something that's relevant today, in your student's life, whatever it might be, it's on your heart that you're just like, I want to speak against this and speak some truth into it?
Last week at camp with the students, towards the end of the week, there was kind of a call from the way camp is ordered. At the end of the night, there's like the worship time, and then after that we have church group time where I can get my youth group together and talk to them about whatever I want to talk to them about. And in the sermon, he talked about that God is calling us to be faithful in witnessing to others. That was part of the message. And he shared the story about how his grandmother came to know the Lord because she spent the night at the house of a friend of hers who was a 7th grade girl who read her Bible and invited her to church the next day. And that led his grandmother to Christ and spread out, and his whole family is faithful in following the Lord. And so I get them together, and what God is kind of brewing in me to talk to them about is the idea that I think one of the lies that not just, especially teenagers, but not just teenagers, I think there are many people in the world that have bought this lie, is that they don't have the power to change lives. That you don't have the power or the ability to affect real change through your actions and words in the lives of people around you.
Yeah.
That, I'm just a drop in the bucket at the end of the day. My vote doesn't count. My word doesn't count. My input doesn't count. They don't need me to volunteer at church. They don't I can't. There are people in the world that are special that can make change. I'm not one of those people. That's a lie from the pit of hell. And it's a very dangerous lie for two reasons. One, God is calling you to be change in the world around you.
Yeah.
In many of the ways that we were talking about previously as being made in the image of God, but also in witnessing and sharing the gospel, right? The story that the pastor there shared, it was a 7th grade girl doing something as simple as reading her Bible when she had a friend over at her house and inviting her to go to church with her in the morning, led to generational faithfulness.
Yeah.
Like, if you don't believe that your impact can make a change, then you're wrong. And so, like, have faith that God can use you. And refusing that is what you're testifying when you refuse to believe that, is you're saying God is not powerful enough to use me. And you're also denying what it means to be human, because we have the power to affect change, both positively and negatively. And that's the other reason why it's dangerous when people believe that lies. They think, well, I can say or do whatever I want. It's not really going to impact the people around me.
Yeah.
I can, this thing might be wrong, but like at the end of the day, like, who's it going to hurt?
Yeah.
It's only going to affect me. It's like, that's often not true. And I was talking to the teenagers about this because, you get in camp and everyone's kind of in a closed space and you're tired and you get cranky. And so they were saying some mean stuff and at times, and I was like, look, I know from experience, and I shared some stories with them, but I won't for the sake of time. You can say something to a friend that will permanently alter your relationship with them for the rest of your life, because you said something thoughtlessly that was hurtful. And you have a choice to be intentional whether or not to use this power that you have to influence people and to influence lives for good or for evil. And if you aren't intentional about it, someone's going to use you. 99% of the time, it's not someone good.
Yeah.
So don't let yourself be used for evil purposes, because you can do powerful things. I think that's a lie I would speak truth into.
Yeah. Dude, that was good stuff. I feel like this was a well-rounded podcast, too. We laughed, we cried. It was like the whole experience. This was awesome. Dude, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody,
Always.
for listening. Dude, I have to have Cody back at least once a season now. This is awesome. Got a lot from this. I feel like I got a lot from this, so I know somebody else out there is going to get a lot from this. So thank you again for being on here. We'll call it there for this episode. I'll see y'all back next time.
Peace.